Hello and welcome to a RackForms job demo. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at the definitive calendars job in RackForms. That is, if we want to work with calendars in terms of forms, this is definitely the job you should be looking at. So let's kind of start off and take a look at the first page here. So the first page, we have essentially three input fields. The first one is labeled text field as date input. And the idea here is, as we'll see in just a second, sometimes browsers, and I imagine as time goes on, this is going to become more and more prevalent. Browsers will actually provide date controls for what we would usually have considered standard text fields. Going one down, we have a single field calendar input. And so traditionally, if we want to get date data, we'll use the calendar item in RackForms. And then the third one is something that we like to refer to as database-friendly date options, which is the same calendar item, but we have enabled a special mode for it so that it saves nicely to a database. We'll get back to that in just a second. The second page of the job here, just to kind of talk about this before we run the demo, is we are going to send the results of particularly these two fields into the database, and we are going to save those to the name and date time slots in our database. And then we're going to collect the last insert ID into a session variable called ret, and we use ret for our database query on our final page to actually pull out the values that we just saved to the database, and then we're going to populate, or probably more accurately pre-populate, these two fields with the values that we just saved. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So I'm going to go ahead and run the job. Now here's the first kind of interesting thing. So I'm on Firefox, I think version 40, it's early 2016. So I'm actually a few versions too old. Maybe by the time you view this video, Firefox will already support this. But the interesting thing is, if I open Chrome and run the same version of the form, you'll actually notice here that it looks different. And in fact, it actually gives me a calendar control. So what's basically happening here is in RackForms, I have tagged this particular field with an HTML5 type of date. And so again, depending on the browser, you're going to get a different set of controls for things like that. And it just so happens to be that Chrome as a browser is actually taking that field. Oops, let me pop open Chrome again. Chrome is actually taking this field and giving me a built-in calendar control. So it's something that's kind of interesting and something to keep note of. Perhaps someday all browsers will have built-in controls like this. But for right now, it's usually safer to actually use our built-in calendar field. And again, the reason why we do that is because on Firefox, this doesn't actually do anything. So if we wanted to rely on this to input dates, that would be somewhat of a problem. Okay, so let's talk about the actual calendar input fields. So the first thing then is we have a basic calendar item. You'll actually notice it's got this value put in right here. So what does this actually mean? How did it get there? Well, sometimes we actually want to provide a timestamp to our users. And maybe we want to do that behind the scenes. Doing what I'm doing right here is a little bit strange because most users wouldn't know what this actually means right here. But just kind of put this in just to show you that this is essentially a text field, but it can be overridden with essentially formatted data. And what we're going to do is we're going to save this to the database as a simple text element. So it can essentially be anything we want, but it also means that we can format it the way we want and display it the way we want very easily to our users. The downside to this method is that we cannot sort with this in the database, right? So the database, this is not a native date time or timestamp field. So if we want to use this data for something interesting like sorting, or maybe for some other applications that are going to need timestamp or date time fields, this is not at all an appropriate option. This is just for display only right here. That is using a calendar with, in this particular case, the single field American or single field European. And in fact, I should say that either of these two single fields right here are going to be kind of like freeform only for display purposes activity. Now, by contrast, if I want to save a date to the database, I'm going to use one of these TS, DT values. And what this essentially means is the TS is for timestamp and the DT is for date time. And that just means that if I want to work with RackForms and I want to create date values that I can send to the database that I can then sort by or export as like native date data, I'm going to want to use one of those two. And when we do this, it is important to note right here that RackForms will actually change the appearance of this field to be a 3-field item right here. So instead of just being like a free-form text where I can, even do things like this, just like put in any values that I want, this is much more restricted. It's only number values, and RackForms is going to enforce that when I put these values in, it works with the type of calendar that we put in. So for example, do I want it European, German formatting, or American formatting? Okay, so the input of this form then, just to summarize, is actually pretty simple. I have a simple date field, which in this case has an HTML5 type of date. This is an interesting thing, but probably not something you want to rely on, so we'll kind of skip past that for now. The other 2 items then are native calendar items, so we get them from input calendar. And the first one is only for display purposes, and the reason why is because it doesn't have the TS or DT after it. This is just for display purposes only, because when it goes to the database, it's not going to a date time or timestamp field. However, if we want to save to a date time or timestamp field, we have one of these TS or DT values, and you'll notice we actually have one for each formatting of a calendar, so American, European, and German. And when we submit these, then these guys, let me pop open my database application here, they will actually be saved to these custom fields in the database. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when I submit this. So here's a table it's going to go to. It's going to go to FB demo, and let's just submit this through. Okay, so if I refresh my data right here, you'll notice that the name field is now inbound with the value that I put in that first field, and the DT field is actually gotten the date time timestamp of the field from our second field. Now, the important part right here is this DT and TS, as they sit in the FB demo field, are actually special fields. So they're not text fields like the name field is. They're actually either date time or timestamp right here. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to working with RackForms, always use date time. Timestamp is interesting. It has its uses for many things, but it's sometimes not as easy to work with when you need to pull data back out, especially when it comes to formatting it. So therefore, always use date time. In other words, when we now save to the database, what we're going to do is something like this. We're going to insert in the FB demo. We're going to go to the name and DT fields, right? So our SQL here is pretty basic. And then importantly, for our 2 values, I'm going to first select the basic time, which is just simply this field right here. But then for this guy, notice I have this underscore DT. So underscore DT basically means this is the date time version of that form field. And I want to bring that up to you because if you actually notice here, when I bring open my dynamic variable picker, the date select database, which is this field right here, actually has 2 variants. The first is the DT value, and you'll actually notice that we have a little hint here. It says insert calendar value as SQL DATETIME, and that's why we have recommended there because that's usually what you want to do. But we also have insert calendar value as an SQL timestamp. So generally speaking, again, in RackForms, you want the date time value, but it is important to note that this is the same field. It just has a few different ways that we can pull the data out. And we want to save it to the date time. We're always going to use this value right here. And so that's what happens then. We insert it as the date time value. Now, when it comes to pulling this back out, again, I mentioned briefly here that we're actually saving a session variable with the last insert ID variable. When we do that, then we're actually going to pull that record that we just saved from the database. That's what we're actually looking at right here. I should actually note that this form is using a redirect. So that's how when we submitted this form, we just automatically went to this page. Very, very handy to have those sometimes. And then basically when we're actually pulling and displaying these values out, it's actually quite simple. So all we're basically doing is we're saying for the 2 fields that we have, in this case, I have a simple text field, so not a calendar field, but just a standard text field, which its default value is set to the name field from the database. So this query is pulling the name and date time columns. And when it comes to pre-populating this, all I have to do is just select name. And for this calendar item, for its default value, all I have to do is select a date time or timestamp compatible value. Again, though, usually date time. And when we do that, then we get something that looks like this. So this guy right here is, again, it's a date, but it's only a date insofar as it has formatting which we humans commonly associate with the date value. There's nothing intrinsic about the data format here that says this is a date. However, this guy, because it was saved in the database as a date time field, is very much data that is formatted with a specific set of rules. And so because of that, then not only does it show a particular way in my database, when we actually try to populate our calendar item, which again, notice here, our calendar item is one of these TS or DT compatible fields. When we do that, it is going to, that is RackForms, is going to properly display that value to our users in the same format of which we submitted it in. In other words, February 25th of 2016, the date that we had put in there. So that is a quick look at the calendar field. The one thing that we didn't cover right here is using calendars with builder jobs. When we make one of those videos, we'll go ahead and update our links with those as well, that we should have when it comes to builder files, just to kind of point this out here, we should have builder with calendar methods 1 and 2 right here, and a few other jobs that deal with calendar items as well. So we shall leave it at that. Any questions, please let us know at info@rackforms.com, and thanks for watching.